Welcome, everyone, to this special pre-election issue of the Doorstep podcast. I'm Nick Gvosdev, your co-host, senior fellow at the Carnegie Council.
And I'm Tatiana Serafin, also senior fellow here at Carnegie. Less than a week, Nick, less than a week till midterms. I've been telling everybody, midterms are more important than presidential election years. I don't know why they're called off years. It drives me nuts. They are so important, and we have so many young people running for office. And we have today with us in a minute, we're going to be speaking with Layla Zaidane from the Millennial Action Project about just what's happening with all the new voices rising and a movement that is a decade plus in the making. I love what she tells us in a minute about widening the aperture, looking at history and historical change. I think this is such an important discussion today. But before we go to Layla, I want to also tell all of you listening today that we have a really interesting book talk coming up, speaking of widening our lens and looking at history and what we can learn from it. The book is called Personality and Power by Ian Kershaw, November 16th at noon. The registration link is already up at carnegiecouncil.org. Should be a great discussion and a great look at what is leadership here in the 20th century, leading into the 21st century, as we go into an election and post-election discussions. So very excited to talk to Layla right now. Thanks so much for joining us today, Layla, to talk about the Millennial Action Project, which I'm so excited to learn about. I want to say first, though, we are all Georgetown SFS grads. So shout out to Georgetown, shout out to SFS and all those in our audience listening from Georgetown and SFS to get started today. And also all the youth listening at Georgetown, which I certainly hope are a lot. And that's what we're going to be talking about today with you. I mean, I have so many places to start, but let's start with your Teen Vogue piece. So I teach political reporting, and we were reading your piece the other week in class because I thought it was so powerful, and what you pointed out is so powerful, in terms of the numbers of people under 40, 45, you can define what you're looking at in terms of numbers of young people in running for office. So I want to ask you about that first and those numbers. But also this idea that Millennial Action Project has been around for a decade. I mean, this is now a movement. And I want to say that first, because I think in general in politics, people get involved in the media in this horse race reporting so that it seems like it's only happening today and the stakes are only today, but that's not correct. We need to look at politics as a long game. And the other thing we read in our class, and you might have read this when you were at Georgetown, is Jane Mayer's Dark Money, talking about the libertarian conservative movement and how that started in the 50s and 60s and how they have made inroads on the ground, boots on the ground today. And we need to look at other movements. And so Millennial Action Project is that movement. Thank you so much for joining us. So what was that Teen Vogue article as the start and intro into the Millennial Action Project?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me. I don't know if this is the appropriate moment for us to all start singing the fight song or to have some sort of, Georgetown cheer that I don't know if that'll turn people away from the podcast. So maybe I'll refrain myself for now, or your production team will edit it out. But yes, this upcoming September, Millennial Action Project will be celebrating a decade of being in existence, and it's insane to think about. And just to set the stage, our mission is really about connecting, engaging, and mobilizing a generation of young leaders. And so it's really much bigger than just electing any one candidate in a specific election cycle, but really making sure that the part that we forget about in politics, the part in between elections, the governance part, that young people are set up to be successful when they do the really hard work of solving problems for a really diverse country. And so what Millennial Action Project does is we help connect them through something we call future caucuses. So we've got a chapter in Congress, and then we're in 31 states across the country. Each one is led by a Democrat and a Republican, in some cases, 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans if it's bicameral. And really the work is just introducing them to each other and giving them a permission structure to build relationships across the aisle, to identify policies they want to work on. And then we'll help connect them to the really smart people who can help make those ideas a reality. The Teen Vogue article, I think for us was really important because all of this movement building, right? Sort of young people operating in a different kind of political framework in 2022 than sort of people are used to in the old playbooks of like the 50s and 60s and 70s. We're living in a new world today. And so it's really important for us to be able to tell that story so that people don't keep repeating the same narratives about what it means to be in politics, what it means to be in our institutions, what it means to be an elected leader. And so we were really grateful to be able to shine a spotlight on some of the work that young people across the country are doing that I think busts some of the myths that people are used to hearing about the partisanship, not just of our institutions, but of young people in particular, which I think people tend to give them a little bit of a bad rap, or at least stereotype how extreme young people might be. And it turns out they're actually really good at bipartisanship. They're actually statistically better than their older counterparts at building coalitions, working across the aisle, and actually getting things done. And I think that's a really important story to tell. And for me is a story that is full of hope that the next decade might actually usher in a more functional democracy stewarded by the young people of today and tomorrow.
I wanted to pick up on that point that you ended with, and to kind of get a sense from you about what may define this next generation or this current generation of political leaders. So Tatiana kind of said, where do we draw the line? Is it 45 or 40? I'll pick 40 as the as the upper limit, because I think that reflects, experiences, that the set of experiences then. So an under 40 politician running for office is not defined by strong memories of the Cold War, if of course they have any memories of the Cold War. So that, defining issue for American politics, which so defines the older generations in some ways, is not there. The whole debate of the 90s, the Clintonian response to Reaganism is now also, distant in the past. What would you see as some of the defining characteristics of, as you said, the greater sense of bipartisanship, greater sense of working on coalitions? What are some of the coalitions that may be forming that you could see would define this next group? And considering that, President Biden was once a young politician and he was defined as a member of the class of 74, that came in, and that has really shaped his politics ever since then, was, when he first entered the Senate. Is there a moment that you see now that we're going to talk about a class of 2022 or the 2020s as being a decade where millennials really kind of take center stage in politics? And what might define some of the issues or coalitions? What are you seeing?
Yeah, I love the framing of this question and really rooting it in history and the political memories of the people who are at the seats of power right now, and sort of how that informs their decision making. And when you look at millennials or increasingly now Gen Z, not having those memories, those lived experiences, at least, certainly may have studied it, but not lived through things like the Cold War, things like the hyperinflationary era, and in fact sort of the opposite, right? When we experienced the bank bailout after the housing crisis, sort of actually seen an influx of money not necessarily lead to sort of the same, right, like situation that so many people had total PTSD over. And so I think that's really important to sort of center how we think about what informs the perspective and the worldview of this generation. And so millennials really came of age. I was just entering high school when 9/11 happened. And that was the first sort of major breakdown of a national institution that I really taken for granted, right? Sort of the national security apparatus that existed to keep me safe, to keep my family safe. Then you sort of fast forward into, as I mentioned, sort of the Great Recession, the housing crisis, exploding student debt, a global pandemic. And you start to see time and time again, sort of these failures of institutions for things that we were promised would work in a certain way, not work. And I think you look at that at the same time as you see an explosion in technology and digital communications and this really powerful sense of entrepreneurship, of problem solving outside of the existing apparatuses that we were told is how you solve problems. Now, all of a sudden, you've got young people starting digital media companies, right? Things like Facebook, things that, we can talk about sort of the implications of what that has done in the past, 15, 20 years. But really this idea that young people were rolling up their sleeves and felt called to fix a problem, and maybe they weren't going to do it through the institutions or the sort of frameworks that we had always thought was the vehicle by which you solve problems. And so that's what I see moving forward, is this sense of, you can't really put me in a box. I still have this idealism and this desire to solve things, to fix things. I'm civic minded. I have an altruism. I think that those are all really characteristic of millennials. And you'll see that now applied as we channel that energy into political institutions. I think that's where we see a lot of the tension right now, is sort of the reconciliation of a centuries old institution reckoning with this really disruptive nature of how we are pragmatic in solving problems and how we just sort of cut through the BS and go for it. And I think millennials were on the vanguard of that. I think Gen Z is even more well suited to that kind of outside the box thinking.
I think one of your initiatives, and I do want to highlight it because that really interested me when I was reading about your initiatives, is the technology initiative, is to actually, maybe get rid of all that paper in government, and to modernize and think about transparency. And I think transparency is probably, along with communication, which I want to talk about separately, one of the biggest drivers I see of change in looking at the work that you're doing. This idea that you have to have access to information in order to make better decisions. Can you talk more about that technology project?
Yeah, it's again, I think born of our experiences, of the reality that if we want to do something, if I want to get in touch with somebody, I don't have to get out a pen and a piece of paper and write it down and put it in the mail. Like, we've got email, we can text, we've got, computers that we carry around with us at all times that can connect us. And to bring sort of places where that efficiency, that transparency does not exist into what we have come to really expect in every other dimension of our lives. I think that initiative is really born out of matching that up within our institutions. I'll also say, I think it's something that's really sort of bipartisan, right? I mean, you look at the Select Committee for the Modernization of Congress, which is led by Congressman Derek Kilmer, vice chaired by Congressman Bill Timmons, both young people, I should mention. And a lot of it is the really unsexy stuff of just making the institution work better, making the jobs of staffers a lot easier. And in the process, actually rooting out some of the things that in today's day and age have really contributed to an acceleration of polarization in Congress, just by nature of how we share information, how we operate day to day, and how the Congress was originally set up. And so sort of modernizing that to bring us into where we are today, really being, I think, a smart and yet unsexy way of tackling that. We also talk about things like, regardless of what you think about President Obama's initiative to, Obamacare, I could not imagine trying to get my healthcare by like not going on a website and just comparing, different plans the way I would shop for a flight. And so it's little things like that as young people, we've sort of taken for granted how technology has made our lives easier in a lot of ways, and seeing those applications in government, in the deliberative process, and of course, in sort of building that civic flywheel between elected leaders and the people that they serve.
I think there's a lot more that can be done there. Nick, did you have a question?
Well, I just wanted to build on that because it got me thinking, this point about next generation, more millennial and then Gen Z people running for office, used to a very different, set of core assumptions. And I was intrigued by something that you said that about the crossing the aisle, which is that Gen Z and millennials aren't all going to agree on policy, but is there also something that breaks them from their older counterparts on both sides of the aisle? In other words, that as you're working through it, that millennial and Gen Z candidates, whether they are more on the liberal or progressive side, or they're more on a conservative or libertarian side, they may disagree with each other, but that they're also disagreeing and taking different perspectives than their boomer and Gen X counterparts with them. I mean, is there a sense that, over the next 10 years, both the Democratic and Republican parties will evolve differently as millennials take center stage and as more Gen Z cohorts are recruited to office? Is there something that we can say that, this will define whether conservative or liberal, whether libertarian or progressive, will be able to say this is what defines the second wave millennial Gen Z politicians?
Yeah, there's a couple things that come to mind there, because what we've done at Millennial Action Project to try to depolarize and remove the partisan baggage that often gets attached to issues is to use this framing of future focused. And what that does is it really empowers an entire generation to see themselves as on the same team, working towards a future in which they will be alive, and maybe people 20, 30, 40 years older might not be around to be a part of that future. And so really that term future focused has been a powerful one in bringing people together. And what we're seeing in certainly as millennials hatch into real positions of political power, and as Gen Z brings up the rear quite quickly, is climate, energy, conservation. I think that's an issue that is a really, really big differentiator, in particular on the right, between younger candidates and their older counterparts. And we see at the state level, as well as in Congress, a real appetite for investing in things like energy infrastructure, paying attention to grids, electrical grids, sort of innovations like battery storage in order to accelerate the adoption of electric vehicles. These are all things that we really see a big appetite among young people. I'll also say, I think something that tends to get discussed more as a conservative issue or something on the right, that we do see a lot of people on the left really embrace, is this idea of spending and sort of how efficient or inefficient we are with our resources and our government agencies, and how we sort of carry out the things that government should be doing. And I think really tying it back to this idea of efficiency, but also thinking this is my future. We're mortgaging away that if the national debt grows, something that is potentially on my shoulders to bear. We see that as a topic that young people on the left, right, are a lot more open to engaging with. And so again, sort of this idea of like, what does the future look like, and how do we create a coalition of people who are going to be living in that future to then really build for the long term to set us up for success?
Yeah.
Just think it's so interesting to hear this post-partisan discussion that we're having, because that is not what the headlines are screaming. And when I say screaming, that's what I feel like the political headlines are doing to me. Like it's just a big scream, and I think it doesn't help what happened to poor Paul Pelosi, and I do kind of want to bring us to that topic of, we do see, in your article clearly stated, and your research clearly states that hundreds of people, millennials and a couple of Gen Zs, are now running for office, both at the national, federal, state, local levels. But do you also see a concern about, violence? That's not really partisan either, right? This idea that you're not safe as an elected official, and is that a turnoff for people? And that's, of all the noise that I'm hearing and all the screaming headlines, that's the one concern that I have with, getting that next generation to want to participate in a very important part of change, right? You need political leaders that are going to be change makers. But is there a hesitancy because, take away this bipartisanship for the, problem, because I see and I believe that, what you're experiencing and promoting is true, but this idea that violence, though, stops people from engaging in running for office.
Yeah, it's a very real concern, and my heart goes out to the Pelosi family, and certainly anyone who's ever been a victim of political violence. And unfortunately, it's something that we're seeing more and more of, or certainly threats of political violence. And part of it is so easy to quickly get radicalized by ideas that you encounter, in particular online, that reinforce perhaps a fear or insecurity that you have. And quite rapidly, you can see with, certainly as we've seen interviews and conversations with folks who have themselves sort of gone down that rabbit hole, just seeing how quickly that can happen. And so I think that's something that current elected officials need to be really mindful of, in terms of the systemic drivers that enable that kind of misinformation, disinformation, that kind of information ecosystem to exist. At the same time, sort of well-intentioned candidates are also often part of creating this culture of if I don't win, the apocalypse happens, and sort of contributing to a do or die situation. And so there's, again, sort of speaking about maybe some of the structural changes that might change how people campaign, some of the incentives. We've talked a lot at Millennial Action Project about things like ranked choice voting that sort of incentivizes different kinds of campaigns. But as an individual who might be susceptible to getting swept up in a wave of violence, who otherwise is a really well-meaning citizen, there's certainly some things that I think our current elected leaders need to be paying attention to in order to break the cycle that we're currently on. Now, what that means for candidates is, yeah, it's a scary time to think about going public in that way, to put your body, your family on the line in order for something bigger and greater. I think that's why the report that we released today, the Millennials on the Rise report that tracks every single young person running for office, was actually quite hopeful for us to see that despite this environment where real threats of violence exist, it's really hard to get any piece of legislation passed. people don't tend to think about the word politician and honorable in the same sentence. There's a lot of reasons why you might not run for office, and to see the growth among millennials, a 57% jump in young millennial candidates for Congress this cycle, I think that's quite hopeful. That tells us that people acknowledge that there's a problem, but they're not shying away from throwing their hat in the ring to try to fix it.
Do you think, another thing that, I see is the funding for races. Do you see that holding back, or do you do any work on that? And I know that, certainly super PACs fill in a lot of holes, but you still need money to run a campaign.
There's a bunch of barriers to getting elected, certainly. And let's be honest, money is one of them. The campaign finance that enables certainly the incumbency advantage, as well as just older voters having more access to networks of wealth, are all reasons why it's a lot harder as a young person to get your name out there, to get elected ultimately. Now, that being said, we've seen examples of candidates be really creative in sort of connecting with voters, getting their message out, and ultimately being successful. And so, I was just talking a little bit about how technology has a lot of harms. I think this is an area where young people maybe have a slight advantage in how savvy they are with digital media and how they can leverage those platforms to connect with regular people. That being said, I think it takes so much more effort to do that kind of work with less money, with which to reach sort of new people, hire volunteers, sort of do all of those things, that it does disadvantage young people who don't have access to tons of money when it comes to winning races.
Do you think that, speaking of young people, and I know, I don't know how much you look at this in particular, because I know you're focused on looking at the people running for office and supporting them and creating those coalitions. But do you think that, for all of the focus on Gen Z and how many more millions of Gen Z voters there are, that the politicians that are the incumbents and that are part of the old system, that system that we're trying to change, really take Gen Z voters seriously? And I'm just looking at some early voting numbers, and the percent of early voters from 18 to 24 or 18 to 40 is quite low when compared to older voters. And that to me, when I was looking at the numbers actually yesterday, was frankly disappointing for all of the hype.
Yeah, and I think this is where everything that happens in between elections matters so much. And we've got this sort of backwards, right? Where we're like, whoever shows up to vote is who I'm accountable to. No, you are accountable to everybody, and it is your job to give them something to believe in so that they show up to vote for you come election day. And instead, we've backed ourselves into a corner, right, where we're fighting over an increasingly shrinking pool of voters, in particular in primary elections, that makes it really expensive and I think frustrating for candidates and for elected officials. Gen Z is like every generation of 18 to 29-year-olds going back to like the 70s turns out at the lowest rate of every generation. And I think that's not unique to sort of the young people of today. That's true of every sort of the youngest generation, whoever they were at that period of time. I think one thing to take note of is that there has been an increase in youth turnout over the past few midterm elections. And I think in particular, Gen Z becoming a little bit savvier about what it means to hold elected leaders accountable. And then we'll see what ends up happening after election day. But I think we saw in 2018 a real jump in young people turning out to vote, and so we'll have to see what happens after election day. But I think we are on a trajectory where we're seeing Gen Z and millennials outperform where young people were when they were their age in previous decades.
I think that goes to your hypothesis that there is change afoot, and that coalitions are being built. And I know that primarily.
And can I just, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but just to say that it's part of what you opened with, right? And talking about, like, it's not a short-term strategy to change a centuries old institution. It is a movement, it is long-term change. And so you have to widen the aperture when you look at what's happening to really take in the context of what each individual data point means. And so I think sort of this is an example where if you zoom out just a little bit, there's actually a lot of reasons to be quite hopeful.
I love that analogy. Let's widen the aperture now for the world. So let's not only look at the US, but also the world. And I know that that's not necessarily the focus, but you had me really thinking about this idea that, okay, we're going to be we're going to cross party lines. We're going to create coalitions. Half the world is under the age of 30. Half the world is under the age of 30. I love saying that. Half the world is under the age of 30. Let's widen the aperture and see what's happening in Ukraine, what's happening in Iran, what's happening in the US, that we're more interconnected than we talk about. And so now I'm also on this new PSA to stop saying foreign policy, because the word foreign means strange, and it's not strange to be global and interconnected. And so I'm wondering what you see your young leaders talking about in terms of those global connections. Especially, you do a lot of work at the state level, and we've done some talking here at the Doorstep about these subnational alliances on climate, right? Where cities are getting more involved with climate, where the state of California is the 4th largest economy in the world, bigger than Germany, right? So like where states really do matter, and in a way that maybe in the past nobody's thought about. And so I'm going to upend this idea of foreign policy, and I'm saying and talk about what you're talking about, this like post foreign policy world, this like idea of connectedness. I mean, how much of that are you seeing on a global level? Are you seeing global connections, whether in your congressional caucuses or in your state caucuses?
Mm-hmm. I love that. Stop saying foreign policy. I'm into it. And I'll say too, just on a personal note, part of what got me interested in going to the School of Foreign Service to begin with is because my family, both of my parents were born in Morocco, and everyone in my family lives abroad. And so as I really reflected on sort of my place in the world and the people who I loved and where we were, there was this sense of, how do I make meaning of sort of the international nature of how we live, what makes us thrive, sort of economies that link us. And so I love this idea that there's no such thing really anymore of just sort of like foreign policy, because everything really does connect. And your example of climate is such an apt one, because that is probably the biggest example, and one that intersects quite nicely with the legislators that we work with as a priority, where there is, I think, a lot of interest in both learning from, but also understanding the ripple effects of sort of things like trade, things like technology, things like climate policy that really impact at a super local level, right? You think even about like what the policy towards China means for a farmer in Wisconsin, right? That's not foreign policy. That is like a kitchen table issue. And so there is, I think, a real savviness about those implications. And I also think that, there's also just, we've grown up having access to just understanding that there are other people besides Americans in the world, like, go figure, there's others. And so I think that's quite natural to be even curious about like what's happening in this country, and how can I as a young leader sort of learn from what's happening there, either to copy or to completely try to not do it all. I don't know how much that translates into voters being motivated to sort of prioritize that in their decision making, but I will say, sort of from an elected leader perspective, it's very important.
Yeah, and I am going to be so curious to see what happens next week. We have less than a week to the midterms. Thank you so much for joining us today to help explain how the youth are powering change and widening the aperture. I love that. I love that expression. And thank you for doing that with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure. Hoya Saxa.
Thanks for listening to The Doorstep, sponsored by the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs. For more, go to carnegiecouncil.org. Stay healthy and safe.